Hello, all. It is Cody Stoffer here with the Playmakers Corner podcast, and this is episode 276 where we continue our season previews here. I have made my way from 5A to 4A and now into 3A here, where I'm very excited to talk about these teams, how their season went last year, talk about some of the players that graduated earlier this year in the spring of 2023, while also discussing some of the players that will be coming back looking to make an impact on this team this next season. And then I'm going to project how many wins they have. So, I'm going to be talking about all the 3A teams today in this episode. And then I believe that I still have some 3A teams coming out on Monday, as well as to a talent. So, all that being said, I'm going to just discuss really quickly Battle Mountain here. Talking about last year, it just doesn't seem great, seeing as not only did Battle Mountain not win a game, but they had to forfeit half their season. And I had to double check just to make sure that they even had games scheduled for this upcoming season. So, I looked at their schedule and it looked like, they had games scheduled and whatnot, and that they were just going to try and live life without Tyson Vasquez, Carlos Sanchez, and Armando Madrano here, who looked like the main contributors from like the news articles and stuff that I could find, and return guys like Edgar Ruiz, Caden McCommons, and, looking at guys like Kitts and sophomore Zach Irwin. But according to one of my sources, it does not sound like Battle Mountain will have a varsity team this year. So, if they do, I don't know if they'll win a game. And, if they don't, that's my reporting on that. So hopefully Battle Mountain, if they need to take a year off, just kind of recoup a little bit. Maybe, just make sure that there's interest to even have a program, or maybe drop down to 2A, honestly, might be the way to go for the squad that just really struggled the past season, obviously, and even into the year before that a little bit. But they've had good players, so hopefully, this program can make a bounce back. But now we could talk about the Summit Tigers here, who, were all but flawless, dropping big scores to open up their non-league schedule, then squeaking by Woodland and Thompson Valley before Durango kind of kicked them in the teeth. But, that was in Durango, that was on the road, and not to be discouraged, Summit won their other two league games that mattered, getting their revenge against Palisade, who kicked them out of the playoffs last year, and then beating Glenwood Springs. They had two forfeit wins to end the season, and I think that going 3 weeks between football games had something to do with their playoff loss at home to Frederick, which kind of felt like a worse version of Palisade, so it was a little confusing. But, I mean, their last game was on October 21st, and they didn't play a game then until November 11th, which is just really unfortunate and kind of nuts. So that was, that was the story of the season through the direct game results. But let's talk about some of the seniors that made it possible, like Jack Shearholtz, who was a Playmaker of the Week prior, in his career, and was the biggest catalyst to their success, throwing for 1,496 yards and rushing for another 793, while throwing for 11 and rushing for 12 touchdowns. His dual threat ability and the ability to stretch the field made the Tigers almost impossible to defend for most squads. He was quite easily their MVP last season and will not be possible to replace. I'm not saying that they can't have good quarterback play, but I just don't think to that level of production and efficiency that he had. Speaking of production here, 7 different receivers caught touchdowns and 5 of them graduate, including 4 seniors that went for triple digits in yards with Elam, Cheek, Cole, and Trujillo. Now on the defensive side of the ball, there were, some impact players. I mean, you could talk about a lot of those same guys as far as Zach Elam and Will Cole having, interceptions, and, Christian Broughton also having a pick, and those three combining for 17 pass deflections and 106 tackles, while Cole recovered 2 fumbles and Elam forced 5 tackles for loss. So all, for those guys making their impact fell on the offensive side of the ball, catching the football, moving the chains, getting into the end zone, and then on the defensive side of the ball, forcing turnovers, tackling dudes, and, just overall playing very efficient two-way games in that group. But I also need to talk about Keaton Smith, who almost reached 100 tackles and ended up in the backfield a trio of times with tackles for loss. But most importantly here on the defensive side of the ball, I would say, was the second best rated interior defensive lineman in the class of 2023, according to Playmakers Corner scale here in Rubrics. Be sure to always listen to those top 5 senior position episodes. But one of them was Eli Krawchuk here, who utilized great play recognition and ability to stop the run, anchoring this team en route to 18 tackles for loss, where he could really pop opposing ball carriers and bully offensive linemen while also being tasked with blocking for the offense, and was an absolute beast who doesn't return to the fold this season. I believe he's playing at Mines, if I remember correctly. Colorado School of Mines, that is. So, that's very exciting for all those guys. And then when looking at the returning playmakers here, the second leading rusher was Ben Elam, who ran for 281 yards and a pretty respectable 5 scores. And then Jackson Archambault and Emilio Jane were the top 2 receivers in yards and scores, combining for 700 plus yards and 7 receiving touchdowns, and will be asked to do much of the same for whoever is next at quarterback. Archambault on the defensive side of the ball had 55 tackles, which was good for third best, and 3 tackles for loss, while Ben Elam defensively had 36 tackles this past season. So returning a couple of pieces from last year, but let's go ahead and look ahead to this schedule for the 2023 fall season. So they open up against Basalt. That's actually a 2A squad. They graduate the majority of their offense, but they bring back a lot more on defense. So I would not write this off as just a win for Summit. Woodland Park was a playoff team last year, so it'll be interesting to see how this matchup goes. They were one of the lower seeded playoff teams, to be completely fair here. And, their season preview will be coming out, I want to say, not this coming Monday, but the Monday after that. But, it looks like they had a decently young team as far as, guys who were able to score. They're bringing back their quarterback as well as their lead tailback and some wide receivers. So I think that, this Woodland Park team could potentially win this game. Thompson Valley definitely should win this game at home against Summit. But, Summit will have a chance to bounce back. They do have a home game against Conifer, who, had their struggles last season in, 3A League 4 here, but ultimately ended up finishing 5-5. And they have Air Force commit Grady Forsyth playing both tight end as well as defensive end, I want to say, and Wyatt Nichols at quarterback. So, yeah, once again, I think that this is probably a game that Summit struggles with and maybe loses. But I think that they bounce back with wins over Wheat Ridge and Lincoln. Both those teams did experience up years, but I just don't think that they experienced enough, or that they showed enough to warrant going all my chips in. So then they played Durango. Durango is probably a contender next year, and they return a great quarterback. So I'd say that they probably lose that game, even though it's at home, which is still important. And then against Palisade, this one is definitely a bit of a toss-up, I want to say, just because, they graduated basically all of their rushing yards and touchdowns. So I think that maybe Summit just has a little bit more coming back. Against Glenwood Springs, I don't think that they win this game. I don't think that Glenwood is returning as much, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. But they are returning arguably the most important positions of quarterback, running back, safety, and linebacker. And those guys are guys that can carry a team to a win. So I'll slightly give Glenwood the edge there. And then Battle Mountain, like I said, I don't think that they have a varsity team. If they do, Summit's going to win. And then Eagle Valley is kind of interesting because, there are literally no stats and hardly any articles about them. So I think that Summit should probably win that game should Eagle Valley have a team. So, yeah, looking at this schedule, obviously, there's quite a few games that I don't think that they win, as far as Thompson Valley, Durango, and probably Glenwood Springs being the big ones. And then maybe one more that they just don't win between the combination of Woodland, Basalt, something in there. So, in this 10-game season, they at least win 4, I'd say. And I think on the high end, win 7. No. We'll say 6. I say 4 to 6 window of wins here for the Tigers heading into this coming season. And, we'll just say that they probably go, 5-5. I think that that's a fair assumption. Overall record, that is. But, yeah, no, that's a preview for a Summit there, just with all the pieces that are leaving, and then these younger players trying to pick up the torch here. Hopefully, if they have a guy that can at least get the ball into Archambault and Jane's hands and let them make plays after the catch, then their offense should at least not fall off of a statistical cliff this coming season. Now, as for who I would call the league rivals, at least, the Palisade Bulldogs, this was a team that, I said was going to struggle quite a bit with the schedule that they had created, but with the strength of schedule that they might be able to make the playoffs. And, they had a nightmare start that I talked about, going 0-4 to start the season against Roosevelt, Grand Junction Central, Delta, and Montrose. Granted, those are all playoff teams across the 2 to 4A levels. Delta, even making it to state. And then they pulled off probably one of the biggest upsets in state, but maybe not the biggest upset of their season, beating Golden by a single point, which they rode as momentum over a drubbing Eagle Valley game prior to losing what would seem like a season-ending game to Summit by 10 points, and then losing to Durango. But losing 7-0, was actually kind of huge. So stay with me here, because then after beating Glenwood Springs, they would make the postseason. Obviously, all their losses were to other playoff teams, and they were competitive in these games, only losing by 5 to Grand Junction Central, only losing by 11 to Delta, only losing by 10 to Summit, and only losing by 7 to Durango. And all of this, peaked with their upset win over Northridge in the playoffs in Greeley, winning 14-7. I want to say they were like the 15 seed or something like that. And then their season came to an end against Green Mountain. But either way, I think that this is a season to be very happy about, headlined by the class of 2023 in the three-headed attack of Malachi Espinosa, Rhett Ward, and Phelan Salvati, who all ran for over 800 yards and combined for 24 touchdowns while averaging over 5 yards per carry, and Malachi throwing 5 touchdowns as well. Ward, Rhett that is, doubled as the main producer on defense with 109 tackles and an incredible two-way season, while Tyler Hinton was second on the team in tackles with 68, and 4 of those being for loss, while on the offensive line, he was opening up lanes for this dynamic rushing attack. And then All-State offensive tackle Nicholas Moreno was paving lanes open and also graduates. So 2 big linemen that were a part of obviously a 2,400-plus yard rushing attack, and, the 3 main playmakers on the offensive side of the ball that also, doubled as defensive stalwarts. But let's talk about some of the guys that will be coming back here. You got to look at Trevin Bannon, who is 3rd on the team in tackles, and 2 of those going for loss. And then you also got to look at the combined efforts of Keaton Everett and Easton Embry, who went for 68 total tackles, and Easton actually notching 18 solo tackles, and the duo being the only players with interceptions this past season. And I'm talking combined with those 68 tackles from those sophomores. But, looking at this upcoming season, with so much of this team's identity revolving around Ward, Espinosa, and Salvati these past 3 years, all three of those guys being great, monsters in the gym, being able to lift very heavy, being physical runners, and, being like a grinded out football team. It'll be interesting to see what this team tries to be this coming season. And I think that this will be a season of growing pains and struggles. I don't think that they beat Roosevelt to start their season. I don't honestly think that they beat Grand Junction in their second game of their season. Delta, I mean, they were the 2A champs, or 2A runner-ups, I should say. So that also presents its own challenges as well. Granted, they are graduating a decent amount, but they also are returning more than Palisade, I would say. Golden, this actually kind of seems like a winnable game, but even Golden's returning more, so I'll still project them to win. Evergreen, that was a very, very senior heavy team. So, I guess there's a chance there, but knowing the prestige of that program, I think that that's a toss up. Eagle Valley, they should still win this game regardless. Summit, like I said in the Summit segment, I think that Summit is still probably favored here. Battle Mountain, not sure if they're just going to count that as a forfeit win or if they're scheduling someone else there. And then Durango, they don't beat. And I think that Glenwood wins this year against Palisade, honestly. So, I have Palisade. Their guaranteed wins are against Eagle and Battle, should both those teams be able to even field squads for those games. And then upside wins of maybe Evergreen and Golden. So I'll say a window of wins of 2 to 4, honestly. And I'm probably leaning towards a season that's 2-8, honestly, because this very tough schedule sent this team to be 4-6. And yeah, the team just doesn't have the same players, I don't think, to make that possible for this year. Now it's time to talk about the Demons out of Glenwood Springs here, who, I think that they were competitive and they were undefeated at home, but they were not great on the road, with their only road win being a touchdown win over Rifle, which I think is a quality win against a solid 2A program. But, winning their opening game against Grand Junction that they lost in overtime probably would have went a really long way towards this team maybe making the playoffs. And then, losing to a 2A playoff team in Basalt, and then just not being really competitive against the likes of Durango, Palisade, or Summit is what really stuck the nail in this team's coffin, because they had flashes of greatness this past season. I mean, they ended up beating up on Grand Junction Central, which is so weird that they lost that initial game to Grand Junction. They had a couple touchdown win over Conifer, and a solid enough win over Eagle Valley. And they're mainly going to be carried by a lot of the same guys here in this season. But before we talk about the returners, let's go ahead and talk about the seniors that crossed the stage this past year. And that includes 4 receiver seniors here that eclipsed 100 yards and all graduate in Cole Sherrick, Marcus Aragon, Edwin Olave, and Reese McMillan. McMillan specifically leading the team with 3 receiving touchdowns. And this same batch, once again, were important both ways, having combined for 109 tackles, spearheaded by Sherrick's 34. They combined for 4 tackles for loss, 3 of those coming from Aragon, Marcus, that is, and then McMillan, who notched 2 interceptions, and Olave leading the team with 2 pass deflections and 2 fumble recoveries in this group. So lots of production on both sides of the ball, and just all of them doing something different that was productive towards this team's success. Kodiak Kellogg was tied for the lead in sacks last season while tackling ball carriers in the backfield a couple of times as well, so able to get penetration from the defensive side of the football. And then Alex Erdman was the only other player or senior with 3 tackles for loss to be tied with second on the squad. But the same guys that, were able to help this team win 5 games last year are going to be back this year. Got to start off with Mason Markovich, who, after having a solid freshman season in the fall of 21, followed that up with an impressive 56 tackle and even better 7 tackle for loss effort that saw head and shoulders above any other demons on this defense. And his strength also showed this year with 3 forced fumbles and recovering 2 of them while also blocking a field goal. Oliver Walls was second on this team, recording over 40 tackles as a sophomore, with Mason while also forcing a fumble, recovering one, and notching an interception. So a couple of sophomore studs on the defensive side of the ball. But I think that the headliner here is that this squad came and went with junior Joaquin Sandoval heading into his senior season, who's not only a beast on defense with 3 interceptions and a beast on special teams with 3 blocked punts, but his main role was being the heartbeat of this offense, throwing for just a hair under 1,100 yards and 12 touchdowns, while leading the team in rushing as well with 865 yards and 7 scores. His partner in crime in the backfield was also Mason Markovich here, who had a 6-touchdown season and, was the running back to Joaquin's quarterback here. And, I think that with those pieces returning and those obviously being the keys for success for their wins last season, there's plenty to be excited about. Obviously, returning a quarterback is always huge. He's going to elevate the game, and he's been kind of having to throw to different people every year. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And then Mason is only going to be bigger, stronger, and faster this season. So they open up with an away game against Aspen. I think that Aspen was a very young team last year that's returning a ton of playmakers, but I'm just going to trust in the playmaking of Joaquin as well as Mason here. Grand Junction, they returned some guys as well, but, I think that at home, this is a game that they obviously, I think, should have won last year, and so I think that they take this one. Rifle, on the other hand, is a very interesting case because I really do think that this team is just returning a ton of talent at more places, probably. And so I think that, this game is more on the toss-up side of things, but I would not write off Rifle winning this football game just with, everything that they will have in tow. Because their returning playmaker section kind of took me a minute. So I think that Rifle maybe wins this game. Now, Basalt, I think that Glenwood Springs should probably win this one if I'm being completely honest. I just think that, Basalt is returning a lot of players on defense, but they just don't have the same explosive elements on their offense. So I want to give that to Glenwood. I don't think that they beat Grand Junction Central on the road this time. First off, they have to go on the road, so they still have to travel to Grand Junction anyway. And, I think that Grand Junction just has a decent amount of returning pieces and a solid philosophy to kind of overcome any talent issues. Their last non-league game will be against Evergreen High School, who, like I said, is graduating a ton from last year. So they'll be an interesting case to look at this season. And, but they are going to have decent size up front. Durango, I don't think that they win. Summit, this is a game that, is a bit of a coin toss, but I really think Glenwood should, if they want to prove themselves as a program, they need to close out with 3 wins here against Summit, Eagle Valley, and Palisade. I think that, this could be a playoff team, but they need to beat Summit and they need to beat Palisade while those teams are having down years. Meaning that their only losses could be, if they want to make the playoffs, to Rifle, to Durango, and to Grand Junction Central. They should probably win all of their other games here, but I think on the low end they feel like a 500 team to me. So I'm gonna say window of wins of 5 and then to 7. I probably don't think that they go better than 7-3, but 7-3 should be enough for second in this league and hopefully a playoff experience as a lower seeded team, especially if they play well against the likes of, Grand Junction Central, as long as they're competitive, or even if they win, that could be pretty major. So 5-7, I'm going to be leaning towards 7-3 personally, but, they're going to have to earn it though, for real, with Joaquin, who we've been following since his sophomore starting status. And brace yourselves for another very short segment here as I talk about Eagle Valley, who, outside of one win, which was their, a big win against their rivals in Battle Mountain, who they absolutely destroyed, Eagle Valley was on the wrong end of a lot of not so close games, which I think factored into their forfeit to close the season against Summit. Looking through news articles, I could tell that quarterback Nicholas Ray helped pilot a win over Battle Mountain, but Max Jaramillo, who is responsible for big plays on the offensive side of the ball, would also be graduating. I want to say that he ran for a handful of touchdowns while also catching for a few. And then Julius Peterson, look, we at least know that in his game against Battle Mountain from a newspaper in Vail, that he ran for 6 touchdowns. So, that's a lot of scoring that you're losing on the offensive side of the ball at all skill positions, which is going to be tough. And then as for returning playmakers, there is literally no stats and hardly any articles about them, which is just not encouraging. So this window of wins might be brutal, but also how am I literally supposed to think of anything else? Basalt, I know that they're returning like half of their solid defense. Delta, they're returning a quarterback. Evergreen, they are losing a lot, honestly. But, I mean, even Evergreen at their worst was still probably better than Eagle Valley at their best. Conifer, they probably don't win this game. Niwot, I don't see why not that the Cougars win that game. Palisade, I mean, look, 0-2 window of wins here for the Devils. I'm not even going to bother with more since they don't even bother to report more on their end. And I want to talk about a team that is going to be very competitive this year and I think is going to be I don't want to go as far as saying a contender, but, has the chops and has, on paper, the capability to do so. And that is Broomfield's very own Holy Family High School that, last year went 7-3 before, losing to teams that either made state or semis in both 4A and 3A. I'm talking about the likes of, Broomfield. I'm talking about the likes of Roosevelt, and I'm talking about the likes of Lutheran in the regular season last year. And, they eventually would lose to George Washington in the first round. But, I would say that their highlights were going 4-1 in league, only losing to Lutheran and beating Frederick within a single point to start their season. Now, some of the seniors who will be, who have, I should say, crossed the stage this past spring was Chase McNaughton, who is the leading rusher on this team, tallying 953 yards on 143 carries and breaking 100 yards 5 times in games with his almost double-digit tutties on the ground, but would reach it with his receiving touchdown, the double digits, that is. Nick Kristoff also recorded 2 interceptions his senior year and a pass deflection this season while collecting 69 total takedowns. Nice. And Roman Olson, who had 24 tackles and 3 for loss, was, I believe, second on the team in tackles for loss potentially. Now, some of the players that are returning this year will be, and in charge is the likes of rising senior Dominic Gabriel, who had 678 all-purpose yards, being the Tigers' best returner, but also their leading returning rusher, who averaged 5 yards per carry, and may be aided by rising junior Anthony Scott, who, as a sophomore, only had 13 carries, but still eclipsed 100 yards and found the end zone last season. All 3 top receivers return in Monte Samaras, Jackson Grable, and Ashton Erickson, who combined have 1,200 plus yards and 9 touchdowns coming back to the offense, that in total returns the majority of receptions and scores from their team. And under center will be third-year starter Rylan Cooney, that, in his junior year had the equivalent of the second-year slump, throwing for more INTs than touchdowns. But hopefully with an entire, pair of off seasons as well as a regular season with this junior-heavy squad, the chemistry will improve and take a step in the correct direction. And then, Rylan could have the opportunity to really be gunning for, a playmaker of the year or most valuable playmaker kind of put together here, but it will have to be, a more efficient season than last year. This secondary only loses 4 of their 16 interceptions from last season, bringing back Connor Neely as well as Jackson Grable, who combined for 7 picks. And, Grable, as a junior, forced 3 fumbles, just going ballistic, forcing a lot of, plays on the defensive side of the ball, being a playmaker over there, while also, like I said earlier, being somebody who you could rely on to catch the football, move the chains, and find the end zone. Dom Gabriel also led this team in total tackles with 86 and was a maestro with 5 total forced fumbles and blocking a field goal for a do-it-all level of impact across multiple facets of the football game. Braden Bach led the team in tackles for loss and notched another 68 tackles. Anderson Osborne was a sophomore this past year who had 3 tackles for loss and another 25 tackles. Maybe not the production that I was looking for from his freshman year to his sophomore year, but definitely has to be one of the premier guys, not only on this squad, but in the state, if this team is to be taken seriously. Angelo Odorizio was an all-state honorable mention on the offensive line that they'll bring back, opening up some lanes for some new faces and keeping Rylan upright. Matthew Sakaris brings back some size to the defense after a sophomore season where he had 37 tackles. And overall, this defense returns 9 of their top 13 tacklers from last season. So let's talk about this year. This year, they start off at home against Frederick. They should win this game with everyone that Frederick graduated. Broomfield, they still probably lose this game. That's a very solid 4A squad. Mountain View, this is a team that actually is kind of returning, I don't want to say a sizable amount, but, decent players on the offensive side of the ball. So maybe a little bit of run for their money, but they should still probably win this game. Roosevelt, this would be monumental if they could win this game against a Roosevelt team that I think is at least susceptible compared to the production that they had last year, especially across that senior class there. So, but this game is on the road in Johnstown, which is a tough place to play. And Holy Family hasn't shown the best of capabilities against teams of that caliber, so they'll probably lose that game. But then they have Conifer on the road. I think that that's a game that they should win. They played Lutheran at home. Once again, if they want to compete for league, they really have to be on their P's and Q's in this. But Lutheran is returning. While they do graduate a lot of very good players, they are bringing back their quarterback that piloted this offense last year. So, I think that Lutheran probably wins this before facing off against a Northfield squad that I definitely don't think you should write off by any means, and somebody that overperformed last year and then returns a pretty decent amount of talent to an overwhelming defense. But, I think that Holy Family should still win this game and then close off with wins against Fort Morgan and Lincoln. So at worst, even if they potentially get upset by Northfield, I think that they win at least 6 games and on the high end win 8 games here. So we'll say window of wins of 6 to 8, with my final record prediction still being 7-3. I still think that they're kind of in much of the same spot as last season as far as, the teams that I think that they are definitively better than, but teams that I'm not positive if they are definitively better than. But overall, still a playoff level season, and one that, I'll have to see how I feel about them heading into the postseason, since they've had some pretty serious postseason struggles these past few years. Not only getting past the first round, but even more so the second round and actually being, a semis or state level competitor on the 3A level. So use that as your fire, use that as your fuel, and just go out there and prove me wrong, because, this is a fun team to keep track of. We've had, a good relationship with players of the past. And, I'm excited to see what Rylan here does with his senior year, and if he can really end up on the map, or if he's going to just kind of stay in the same spot, just like this Holy Family team. It'll come and go with Rylan and his performance on the offensive side of the football. The next team on the docket here are the Kennedy Commanders, who did exactly as I predicted and competed tough against the solid Bear Creek squad and Fort Morgan in 2 losses. And they even pulled off what I would say is an upset win over Northfield in a well-coached game. They'll have a new staff this coming year and a lot of new faces, as they were just a little bit on the, overpowered side, or just like not being able to match in the depth of their competition and everything like that. So I think that those are important things. And, with this senior class, it's going to be tough to bounce back because, last season they had longtime quarterback Isaac Cisneros, who had 2,000 scrimmage yards, and 90 total touchdowns over the course of his career here. He'd been starting since he was a sophomore, and, that makes him one of the best signal callers in Commanders history. So that's something interesting there. Now, Antonio Massengel was second on the team in rushing yards with 360. He'll be graduating. Longtime primary target Ron Gallegos Jr. will, will have graduated this past spring, and so will the other four receivers who caught for over 100 yards. RG-3, I should say, for the difference, who led the team with 769 yards and 9 touchdowns, and was the primary go-to as just the headliner of that group. Isaiah Garcia graduates after a few pancakes this season and playing a ton of snaps. Gabe Little was second on the team with 101 tackles and was the leader with 12 tackles for loss and 9.5 sacks, wreaking havoc on opposing QBs and ball carriers alike. That's a huge presence that they're going to miss on a defense that did struggle pretty greatly last year, and so I can't imagine what that's going to look like this season. Sonny Messer graduates after 5 interceptions and a team's second best 7 pass deflections, for this pass defense last year, probably based off of some of the pressures that Gabe Little was generating. Davion Brown led the team with 13 total pass deflections, and then Shamar Bukar was another impact senior in pass defense with 2 pass deflections himself. And that does it for the class of 2023 contributors. Now, talking about some of the returning playmakers, they do have Xavier Agosto, who led the team in recorded pancakes at 5 as only a freshman, while being only one of 3 people to notch more than a single tackle for loss. And I think it's important to keep and win over for the new coach there. Noah Herrera was second on the team with 4 interceptions and will benefit from the fellas up front doing their job. And also the Commanders will be taking back the commander of this defense, Adrian Cruz, who is the leader of the team with 125 total tackles and also had 10 tackles for loss. And then Adam Martinez was also a force on this team with 54 total tackles. Now, this squad does not have, their full schedule fully laid out for this upcoming season, but I'm going to assume that they're just going to run it back and play a lot of the same teams that, were playoff teams like Mesa Ridge and Bear Creek and 4A. George Washington, I don't even know if they win this game because they just have no one coming back on offense really that was important. And, I'd say that the offense was the strength of this team, and they're also missing some of their big impact players on defense. So I think games that they won last year, like Northfield, I don't know if they win that game this year. But Lincoln, that game should be a toss-up. They won that very, convincingly last season, but Lincoln is returning a few skill position guys, so it'll be interesting to see how that Lincoln offense fares against this Kennedy defense. And then Littleton has a brand new staff, so that is a game that is also interesting. I just think that this is going to be a year, unless they have a different non-league schedule, this is going to be a year of a lot of growth here and a lot of experience for this first-year head coach, as I just think that everyone else in the league got better, and Kennedy didn't necessarily personnel-wise get better with the graduation of so many of their studs. So I'm going to say a window of wins of like 0 to 3 here for Kennedy, and it's very likely that they end up as like a 1-9 or 2-8 squad if they repeat the exact same schedule that they had last season. I think that's an important detail to throw in there and something to monitor as we get closer to the season, who they end up scheduling for their non-league games and, the health of their opponents. And speaking of Lincoln, this team stormed out the gate, winning their first 3 games by margins of 14, 4, and 6 to start off on a very strong note before abruptly being throttled by every team that followed. But hey, they got theirs in when they could with non-league play, and you got to respect that and their ability to, break a losing streak that had extended back quite some time. Now, seniors who graduated who were impactful for the Lancers include Benaiah Vargas, who turned up for the Lancers with 82 carries for 357 yards and a leading 3 rushing scores, while also leading the team in total tackles at 67, 6 of those being for loss and jumping onto loose footballs. Jamari Childress was not the most impressive QB, but was the go-to athlete for this team with a team-high 519 all-purpose yards, and then another, or scrimmage yards, I should say, and then another 189 yards through punts, kicks, and interception returns, while throwing 4 scores and rushing for another, and was second on the team with 42 tackles and also getting an interception. Angel Andrada led the team in pass deflections with 5 and even forced a turnover with an interception 1 time. LJ Martinez was a 4.5 tackle for loss, 34 total tackle kind of player here. And then Alexander Bilbrey and Isaac Kilcollins did not have a ton of tackles, but the ones they did have were in the backfield, with both of them being tied for the team lead of 6.5 wrap-ups in the backfield. Now, returning playmakers will include Sonny Garcia, who led the team in return yards as a sophomore and will probably be utilized on offense at a skill position of some kind. King Stansel, as only a freshman, recovered 2 fumbles and had a neat 22 tackles and was in the backfield a pair of times. Desmond Rodriguez rocked on defense with 38 tackles, 6 for loss, 2 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and a partridge in a pear tree, aka the team lead in interceptions with 3, and then 56 total yards of returns off those interceptions. Air Sidner and Sonny Garcia both recorded interceptions as sophomores, with Sonny deflecting a pair of passes as well. And then Salcido did not get a ton of starts his junior year, but wrapped up ball carriers in the backfield 3 times and could use that experience for his senior year to make plays. Now, Lincoln, looking at this roster and just trying to look to this fall 2023 season, this roster is just stock full of sophomores here. So I think that in 2 years now, they'll probably be sniffing closer to that 500 record. But they do have some athletes that could potentially help them get some wins. They do have the benefit of playing Mitchell once again to start the season. They also play Alameda, at home this season. And, I think Denver West, that's going to be their most competitive game, just like it was last year. But they should still get to a 2-1 start before, I think, unfortunately, just really getting hammered by strength of schedule here. They play a competent Inglewood squad. They play Summit, Fort Morgan, Lutheran, Kennedy, Holy Family, Northfield. I think the only game that they could win in that stretch is maybe Kennedy. Because I don't think that they could beat Inglewood with the experienced players that they are returning. So I'm going to say window of wins of, I guess bare minimum 1 to maybe 4 is what I'm going to say for this Lancer squad. And maybe a repeat season of 3 and 7. As for one of my favorite teams from 2 seasons ago, I'm going to be talking about the Fort Morgan Mustangs, who just one season, in fall of 2021, that is, of winning state. They did struggle pretty mightily, graduating a boatload of talent, including all-time Mustangs, and it took some time to settle in and adapt. And you combine this with a pretty difficult schedule, and you will struggle. But they did play in some entertaining football games, but were nowhere near the ranks of a playoff team in 3A. Opening up the season with losses to Conifer by 3, Brush by 12, and you really knew that things were different when they lost to Roosevelt 49-0, which in the years past has been an all-time classic game. So that's both a testament to the mission that Roosevelt was on and how much talent graduated from Fort Morgan. So, those are things to keep in mind. And they did graduate some seniors this year. David Keller was one of the more notable returners in the original season preview last year and responded with 6 rushing touchdowns and 524 yards and did his best Ortega impression with being second on the team in receiving, and he was 4th on the squad with 37 tackles. But obviously not the same impact as Frank Ortega of a couple seasons ago. Keshawn Johnson was pretty ahead of other pass catchers, leading the team with 25 receptions for 382 yards and 3 scores, having more than the next 2 receivers who were also seniors combined. Colin Duckworth was pretty dominant on the defensive line with 71 tackles, which was good for a team best, and also recorded 3 of those in the backfield. And then Gabriel Bosworth and Elvin Yanez both had an interception and a fumble recovery that they take across the stage with them. But there's a ton of returners on this team, and I think plenty of reason to be excited for this team that is used to, having a solid football program. And I think also, this past year was the first time that they had a losing record. And I want to say at least 5 years, going all the way back to man, even in 2017, they still narrowly finished above 500 there. This is a program that is used to sustained success here and has been able to fill, but I think that this senior class just wasn't quite that strong here. So, I think that it's exciting for them to have so many players that were underclassmen or were in their junior year and will be coming back for their senior year to contribute. Oh my gosh, it had been at least 10 years since this team had a losing record, consistently going 7-3 and being one of the top teams in 3A football. Yeah, it's been since 2011. And even then they still won 4 games. So kind of crazy for Fort Morgan to have a step back like this, but let's talk about some of the guys that are going to try and change that narrative and not make it 2 years in a row. Since this team was very sophomore heavy, as evidenced by Angel Lopez, who is second on the team with 2 receiving scores and a rushing score. Trey Romero tried his hand at quarterback, throwing 2 scores, but after throwing 5 picks and around 25% completion, he was way more effective on the ground, rushing for 5 scores and opening the door for J.J. Marquez, who appears to be the QB of the future for Fort Morgan after eventually being handed the keys and at least generating some dynamic element of this offense, throwing for 623 yards and completing 41% of his passes, and just barely throwing more picks than TDs. Charlie Langford only had around 150 yards of offense, but 500 return yards, ended up being second on the team in all-purpose yards at 705, and then on defense had 50 tackles and 4 for loss. They're probably going to get him way more involved in the offense this coming season. Ben Fritzler was second on the team in rushes and yards with 48 rushes for 229 yards. And even though he didn't find pay dirt, he once had a 100-yard game and was only a freshman, so the sky's the limit for the Fritz here. Noah Aguirre went kind of crazy, recovering 3 fumbles and blocking a field goal, all in addition to being second on the team in tackles at 60 and terrorizing ball carriers with 5 tackles for loss. Juniors Oscar Ramirez and Jackson Wiedrich combined for 11 tackles for loss and were first and second for the team, respectively, in tackles for loss. Dominique Vasquez was another scary sophomore, tying for 5 tackles for loss for second best on the squad. And Christian Velasquez is already 200 pounds as a rising junior and used that size effectively to 3 tackles for loss his sophomore season. Fort Morgan here, looking at the window of wins, they are rebuilding something special here with this sophomore class who all saw a lot of action on the field, and I don't believe they will be as much of a doormat this season. That being said, making the postseason will still be a challenge in and of itself looking at the schedule. They do start off with a very close contest against Conifer, I think. I think that Conifer has a few more seniors and just size on their team, so I'm going to err on the side of Conifer in this game, but Fort Morgan, they only lost this contest by 3 last year, so it should be, just as, if not more, competitive this year. Brush, I really feel like that's a game that they should have won last year, and I think that they won't let it slip this year. Roosevelt, I think that this game should be back to its classic status, but I do want to give the advantage to Roosevelt there. Pueblo County, they won that game by 7 points last year. So I think that this is maybe a winnable game again this year since they aren't graduating a ton of guys. Frederick, this is a game that they should win, I think. Now, I think I might have projected Frederick to win this in a former preview, but, Fort Morgan is just returning a lot more dudes here. And so I think that they should win that game. Lincoln, they should win. Kennedy, they should win. Holy Family, probably not. Holy Family is just really senior heavy and, has a bit more experience in the trenches, I would say. Northfield, this is a very interesting game between these two squads and one that I really think could go either way. And then they probably don't beat Lutheran in league play. So, I'd say that they should win at least 4 games this season as opposed to last year. And I think that on the high end, they could win 6. So I'm going to give them a window of wins of 4 to 6. I think that if you make 500 with this schedule, you do have a chance to make the postseason if you are competitive. But I think that 4 and 6 is probably safe for both the window of wins and the overall record that I'm going to project here. And then I look forward to a very strong senior showing from the Mustangs. And the last team of this episode, and the one that I was probably the most wrong about last year, was Northfield. In their first season in 3A, they came to play. And after opening up 2-0 and making a statement on Saturday the 17th when I went to watch what I thought was going to be a good game against Denver North here, they put a 60 burger on them, dominating in all three facets of the game, playing with a very engaging and entertaining level of violence and defense and finesse on the defensive and offensive units. They then ran into a rut midseason, losing to Vista Ridge, Kennedy, Holy Family, and Lutheran before righting the ship against Fort Morgan and Lincoln, and just barely missed the playoffs at 6-4. And I think that the big issue was what I would call the upset loss to Kennedy, because if they had won that game, I believe that at 7-3, you would not be able to deny the Nighthawks' presence as a playoff team. Now, some of the guys that helped them get there last year that won't be able to help them this year include Amarian Richardson, who is a spectacle his senior year, whose stats I don't think are accurate, but, watching him in person, he ran with great speed and agility of a next-level player, running circles around the Vikings' defense in the matchup I saw, and he also had the ability to rip off big plays, as evidenced by his listed long of 62 and his minimum 7 rushing touchdowns that didn't even include, his capability to rip off returns both in the interception game and in the return game as well. So, a 3-facet kind of impact player here, as opposed to Mark Cox, who is just a fierce defensive specialist. He wore number 99 as a linebacker and deserved to be playing that, having great speed and timing on blitzes, leading the team with 9 tackles for loss and 41 tackles, constantly swarming to the ball and leading the team in forced fumbles 3, and also sacked the quarterback 4 times, and was a leader, definitely an emotional leader for this Nighthawk unit. Fellow senior Harlan Owens also forced 2 fumbles on the defensive side of the ball. And then Cardell Collins Jr. was actually a senior and the leader of interceptions for this team at 3. So they're losing, great speed, great violence and leadership, and then, some key role guys as well. But they are returning a ton of, guys on this defensive side of the ball. And I'm saying don't panic, because on defense, as 6 of the 9 players who recorded 20-plus tackles make a return. Headlined by number 32, Jack Easterly, who is above and beyond the leading tackler with 88 total and 8 in the backfield, while also forcing a turnover through the air and a fumble recovery. So Jack Easterly, definitely a watch list kind of guy who is just high motor, high impact, like a lot of guys on this Northfield defense. KJ Minifield had an interception to go with his team's second best, 49 tackles, and 2 of those being for loss. Connor Reese was third on the team in both total tackles and tackles for loss, with the latter being a total of 6 that only has room to grow next season. Jalen Robinson was number 5 in tackles as the last player who had 40 or more, and was in the backfield a total of 5 times. Junior Travis Reese had 3 fumble recoveries this past season and only 6 games played/recorded. So, a senior season that's full of more games could be more lucrative for him, performance-wise, numbers-wise, and maybe wins-wise for Northfield. Cameron Harris was quite accomplished his sophomore season with 2 sacks and 4 tackles for loss in only a half a season of games played. Marcus Wiley will be relied on as the ball carrier this season after recording 315 yards and an absurd long of 91 yards en route to 3 touchdowns. I'm pretty sure that he was asked to step up at times with Amarian experiencing some injuries throughout the season last year. So he's used to that pressure, but I think that he'll be more acclimated to it this season than he was last season. Christian Love was solid at the QB position last season, rushing for 5 touchdowns, but also throwing 13 and eclipsing the 1,000-yard mark. He's a little slow to see the open guy, but can also buy time if need be, but just needs to see routes faster and or make pre-snap reads. So that way he can dial it up to his top target from last season, Cameron Joyce Fairley, somebody who I've kind of had eyes on since his sophomore year. And, after catching 24 passes for 340 yards and leading the team with 5 scores, he's going to be very involved in this offense. He's going to be relied on more. He also got some handoffs and broke the play in rushing the ball a couple times. And, he's got solid speed to make plays in multiple facets of the game here. So the opening week of the 2023 season here will be against Aurora Central, a game that I projected them to lose last year, and they won big, and they should do it again this year since Aurora Central lost a lot of senior talent on top of just not showing to be super competitive with this squad here. And then they got Denver North and Riverdale Ridge. They have Denver North listed a second time, but I don't. That's inaccurate. Obviously, they're not going to play a team twice in 3 weeks, but we'll see who this other non-league opponent is potentially. But Denver North, I think that this game is going to be significantly more difficult than it was last season. I think that it should actually be the competitive game that I thought I was going to show up to, especially since the OC of Kennedy, who toppled this team in an upset loss last year, will be at Denver North with a lot of great playmakers that are returning. So this should be a way more entertaining matchup. Riverdale Ridge is a game that they should win, as well as Adams City. Vista Ridge is interesting because while that team does graduate a ton of players, they are still going to have playmakers, as far as like they had a very young core of wide receivers that do get a lot of work. And, we'll see how they physically match up with this secondary, but I still think that Vista Ridge probably wins that game. They should get their revenge against Kennedy this year and should win this game. And it's really interesting to see how they do in league because, last year they had a losing record in league. But I think with a winning record in league and a potential undefeated run through non-league, we're looking at a 7-3 or 8-2 season for Northfield. They proved me wrong last year, but now the expectations adjusted that. They catered to that. So the expectations are going to be a lot higher for Northfield. This is a team that should really make a push for the postseason. I think at worst, I don't even know if I feel comfortable saying that they only win 5 games. I think that they should win 6 games. I think that their losable games are North, Holy Family, Lutheran, and probably Fort Morgan. But, I will say I'll give them a 5 to 7 window of win range here, with emphasis that they really should be 7-3 to end this season. That's going to be my projected record for the Nighthawks. You've earned my attention. You've earned my respect. But with that comes greater expectations, and it's going to come with harsher criticisms as well as I do season recaps and look at those games. And if I go to one of your games, it's going to come with a way more critical eye as well, because you really just have met those expectations of 3A, and now it's time to follow that up and show that it was not a fluke last season. And that does it for this season preview. I know that it's kind of a shorter one because Battle Mountain and Eagle Valley need to get their lives together here a little bit, but there were some very entertaining teams to talk about. Just as a recap, teams that I actually talked about in depth as far as graduating players, returning ones, and could project a record for their next season included the Summit Tigers, Palisade Bulldogs, Glenwood Springs Demons, the Holy Family Tigers, Kennedy Commanders, Lincoln Lancers, Fort Morgan Mustangs, and last but not least, the Northfield Nighthawks in what should be an interesting 3A league. If you are interested in the other teams in that league, like Lutheran specifically, you're just going to have to wait for other previews. And the way to keep track of when and how and where the previews are coming out is to follow us on social media, whether that's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, where we post the covers to all of our newest episodes and, promote them there. And you could also access the link tree to listen to them. Or you could just look up Playmakers Corner on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or YouTube, where, all these previews are, and go ahead and watch or listen or what have you with all of those, which is pretty awesome. And, go ahead and on our social media, whether it's at Playmakers Corner on Instagram or Playmakers Corner, or Playmaker Corner, I should say, on Twitter or Facebook, go ahead and comment your thoughts on these reactions, on these recaps, on these previews, and, either provide context, agree with us, disagree with us. And, we are always, I personally am ready to be proven wrong. I want to be, but, I will say that looking at how we did last year, we're pretty accurate. We put a lot of work into this. So while it's okay to disagree, just don't be disrespectful is all that I ask. And, let's look forward to what I think is going to be a very, very competitive 3A football season. And, stay tuned for more episodes. I have 3 more coming out next week, so stay tuned for those. And then Gideon and Simon will be carrying the season preview load. So if you haven't heard your team on here yet, they will be coming out soon. And then be sure to follow us on TikTok as well at Playmakers Corner, because I'm going to be posting tiny, like minute long previews for all of the teams that I have previewed. And then Coach V and Gideon will also have TikToks with very short synopses of the teams that they looked at for this season. But I have been your host for this episode, Cody Stoffer, and I will see you, or you will hear me, on Monday.